What you're about to hear is not the sanitized version of war found in textbooks or recruitment films. According to declassified military reports and first-hand field testimonies, some of the most dangerous encounters faced by American snipers in Southeast Asia did not involve enemy soldiers. They involved the jungle itself. Silent. Patient. Watching. In the early years of covert sniper operations deep in Southeast Asian forests, U.S. military doctrine treated the jungle as terrain, difficult, hostile, but ultimately passive. Something to be navigated, studied, and overcome through discipline and camouflage. But as missions pushed farther beyond established perimeters, that assumption began to collapse. Because the jungle was not neutral. And it was not empty. Pay close attention to this part, because this is where the psychological line between combat and survival begins to blur. Sniper teams operated alone or in pairs, sometimes days from extraction, buried beneath layers of foliage so dense that daylight barely reached the forest floor. Absolute invisibility was not optional, it was survival. Every movement was calculated. Every breath slowed. Even blinking too often could betray a position. And yet, despite flawless concealment, many snipers began reporting the same unsettling sensation. They were being observed. Not by scouts. Not by patrols. By something else. At first, these reports were dismissed. Fatigue. Stress. The natural paranoia of men operating under extreme isolation. But the pattern became impossible to ignore. Disturbed vegetation with no human tracks. The sudden disappearance of local wildlife, birds going silent, insects vanishing. A pressure in the air that veterans struggled to describe, but never forgot. The jungle would go quiet. And when the jungle went quiet, something was wrong. Military after-action reports from reconnaissance units began to include unusual annotations. Unidentified disturbance. Animal interference. Predatory contact. Language carefully chosen, stripped of emotion, yet heavy with implication. This wasn't fear in the traditional sense. It was something older. More primitive. Snipers are trained to control their minds under pressure. To dominate fear. To become observers rather than participants. But here, the roles were reversing. In this environment, the hunter could become the hunted without warning. Imagine lying motionless for hours, rifle aligned, heart slowed to a crawl, and realizing that something in the foliage knows exactly where you are. Not because you moved. Not because you made a sound. But because it can smell you. Sense you. Feel your presence as an intrusion into its territory. This was not an enemy bound by rules of engagement. No patterns. No negotiation. No hesitation. The first confirmed incidents were brief. Violent. Often over in seconds. A sudden weight crashing from above. A blur of muscle and claws. A scream cut short. In some cases, the mission continued shaken, compromised, but intact. In others, extraction was immediate. Positions exposed. Objectives abandoned. The jungle had won. What makes these encounters especially disturbing is not just the physical danger, but the psychological aftermath. Survivors described a lingering sense of vulnerability that no amount of training could erase. The realization that even perfect camouflage offered no guarantee. That mastery of the battlefield meant nothing if the battlefield itself rejected you. And this was only the beginning. Because as operations continued, these encounters did not decrease. They escalated. The predators of the Southeast Asian jungle were not random obstacles. They were territorial. Adaptive. Intelligent in ways that defied expectation. And once they began to associate human presence with intrusion or prey, the balance shifted permanently. By the end of this story, you'll understand why some veterans say the enemy they feared most was never listed on a map. And why, decades later, the sound of rustling leaves can still trigger memories no firefight ever did. This is the side of war few are willing to discuss. And we're just getting started. Military records don't dramatize what happened next. they reduce it to clinical language. Dates, coordinates, casualty classifications. But behind those words were moments of raw panic that no training manual had prepared these men for. By the mid-phase of jungle operations, sniper teams began encountering a predator that embodied everything the environment represented: stealth, patience, and overwhelming force delivered without warning. Large, territorial, perfectly adapted to dense foliage. This was not an isolated anomaly. It became a pattern. The first documented cases occurred during extended Overwatch missions. Snipers position high-value routes, remaining motionless for up to 72 hours. The technique was flawless: elevated hides, wind accounted for, scent minimized, waist buried. From a human perspective, they were invisible. From a predator's perspective, they were not. According to field testimonies, the warning signs were subtle at first. A branch bending where no wind moved. The sensation of pressure behind the eyes. A smell: musky, animal, thick, cutting through the damp rot of the jungle floor. Then silence. No birds. No insects. No background noise. Veterans would later say that this silence was worse than gunfire. Because gunfire meant rules. Gunfire meant reaction time. This meant none. One sniper described the moment as the jungle inhaling. The attack, when it came, was explosive. A mass of muscle crashing from concealment with no hesitation. These animals did not probe or retreat. They committed fully. In seconds, a concealed firing position became chaos: gear scattered, vegetation shredded, blood soaking into the earth. In some cases, the sniper survived by pure chance. A rifle discharged at point-blank range. A partner firing blindly. In others, there was no opportunity at all. By the time extraction teams arrived, there was nothing to fight. Only evidence. Claw marks through web gear. Crushed bone. Drag trails disappearing into undergrowth. The technical explanation was simple: apex predators defending territory. The human presence, unnatural scent, foreign movement triggered an instinctive response. But understanding the biology did nothing to reduce the fear. Because these predators didn't behave like expected animals. They stalked. Snipers began reporting the sensation of being followed for hours without visual confirmation. Tracks that appeared, then vanished. The feeling of eyes just beyond the line of sight. Men trained to read terrain now struggled to read intent. And that uncertainty was devastating. Every rustle became a threat. Every shadow a potential charge. The mental load was crushing. Focus fractured. Mission slowed. Decision-making became reactive instead of calculated. This is where the psychological damage truly began. Snipers are taught to wait. To trust stillness. But now stillness felt dangerous. Remaining motionless too long meant vulnerability. Yet movement increased the risk of detection by human enemies. There was no correct choice. Some teams began altering routes, even when tactically unsound. Others broke doctrine by establishing improvised perimeters, a sign of creeping fear, noted quietly in reports but never openly criticized. Commanders understood. They had read the same after-action logs. The jungle was no longer just concealment. It was contested space. And worse, it was learning. Each encounter reinforced a brutal truth: these predators were not random hazards. They were participants in the environment, reacting, adapting, and shaping outcomes. By this point, veterans say the fear had changed shape. It was no longer sudden terror. It was constant pressure. A low-level dread that never released its grip. Sleep became fragmented. Dreams invaded waking hours. Men imagined weight on their backs that wasn't there. Some swore they could hear breathing that didn't belong to anyone on their team. The line between alertness and paranoia eroded. And as we'll see in the next part, the jungle had more than one predator. Some were quieter. Some were faster. And some didn't attack from the front at all. By the time commanders acknowledged the pattern, it was already too late to reverse its effects. The jungle had revealed its first predator, loud, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. But the next threat was different. Quieter, smaller, and far more insidious. Unlike the earlier encounters that ended in explosive violence, these incidents unfolded slowly, almost invisibly. And that made them more dangerous to the mind than the body. Snipers began reporting disturbances that didn't make sense. Equipment shifted overnight without footprints. Boots discovered damp, despite careful sealing. Rations torn open with surgical precision. No drag marks. No blood. No obvious threat. Just evidence of proximity. Military psychologists would later describe this phase as the onset of environmental paranoia, but at the time, it was simply described as unease. A constant awareness that something was interacting with their space while they slept, or worse, while they lay awake pretending to. These predators did not announce themselves. They tested boundaries. Men described waking to the sensation of something brushing past their leg. Pressure on webbing. The faintest vibration against a hide site. Too subtle to react to. Too real to ignore. Firing was impossible. Identification was impossible. Control was impossible. One veteran sniper recalled staring into the darkness for hours, finger on the trigger, knowing that if he fired blindly, he would compromise the mission, and if he didn't, whatever was nearby would learn there were no consequences. This was psychological erosion by inches. Unlike human enemies, these creatures didn't fear gunfire in the same way. They didn't interpret warning shots or flares as dominance. They simply adapted. Shifted patterns. Returned later. The jungle, once a predictable rhythm of sound and silence, became erratic. Night cycles stretched endlessly. Daylight brought no relief. Fatigue accumulated faster than it could be managed. And fatigue kills snipers long before bullets do. Reports mention men losing track of time. Seconds stretching into minutes. Breathing becoming shallow. Muscles locking from extended immobility while adrenaline flooded their system with nowhere to go. In this state, mistakes happened. A twig snapped too loudly. A hide site poorly chosen. A route altered unnecessarily. And every mistake had consequences. Some teams aborted missions not because of contact with the enemy, but because the psychological strain became unsustainable. Commanders rarely questioned these decisions. They had seen the degradation curves. They knew when a sniper stopped being an asset and became a liability. What's chilling is that many veterans say these encounters affected them more deeply than firefights. Because you can fight a soldier. You can understand intent. You can predict behavior. But you cannot reason with instinct. These predators weren't cruel. They weren't malicious. They were simply doing what evolution had designed them to do, and that made them impossible to intimidate. For snipers trained to dominate environments through patience and control, this was a profound inversion of identity. They were no longer the apex presence. They were intruders. And the jungle was reminding them of that fact slowly, relentlessly, until confidence eroded into vigilance, and vigilance into exhaustion. By the time these operations reached their deepest penetration zones, something fundamental had shifted. Men no longer spoke about if an encounter would happen. They spoke about when. And in the next phase, the jungle stopped testing boundaries. It started enforcing them. There comes a moment in prolonged combat when fear stops being sharp. It becomes heavy. By this stage of the operations, American sniper teams no longer interpreted the jungle as background risk. It had become an active variable, unpredictable, uncommandable, and increasingly hostile. The earlier encounters had been warnings. What followed felt like enforcement. The jungle was no longer observing. It was reacting. Veterans describe a shift that is difficult to quantify but impossible to forget. Patterns broke down. Areas that had been quiet for weeks suddenly erupted with movement. Familiar routes became unusable overnight. Animals that once avoided human presence began crossing paths openly, not in panic, but with territorial confidence. This was the most dangerous phase, because predictability vanished. Some encounters were violent, others were not. And the uncertainty between the two eroded discipline faster than exhaustion ever could. Snipers reported moments where multiple threats seemed to overlap: a rustle ahead, movement behind, pressure from the flanks, forcing impossible decisions in seconds. Do you remain still and risk discovery? Do you move and expose yourself? Do you fire and sacrifice the mission? There was no correct answer. One after-action report describes a team pinned for hours, not by enemy forces, but by repeated animal movements circling their position. Each time they prepared to relocate, something shifted in the foliage, blocking the path. Not an attack. A message. This territory was occupied. The psychological toll intensified. Breathing became conscious. Heartbeats felt loud enough to echo. Men fixated on sounds that never resolved into visuals. Some later admitted they began seeing movement that wasn't there, not hallucinations, but anticipation overwhelming perception. This is how environments break people. Sleep deprivation compounded everything. Snipers who once prided themselves on mental endurance began losing emotional control in private moments: shaking hands, uncontrolled anger, sudden tears that made no sense to them. Commanders noticed. Mission debriefs started including language that rarely appeared before: environmental overload, sustained psychological pressure, non-combat stressors affecting operational effectiveness. The implication was clear. The jungle was winning battles without firing a single shot. In several documented cases, operations were altered entirely. Insertion times changed. Routes extended dangerously just to avoid known predator zones. In extreme instances, objectives were downgraded or cancelled, not due to enemy strength, but because the terrain had become too unstable psychologically. This is rarely discussed in official histories, because it challenges the myth of control. War doctrine assumes environments can be mastered, studied, reduced to variables. But Southeast Asia proved that some environments do not submit. They resist. They adapt. They push back. And for snipers, whose entire identity is built on dominance through patience and precision, that resistance was deeply destabilizing. Many veterans say this phase is what stayed with them long after the war ended. Not the gunfights. Not the explosions. The feeling of being outmatched by something ancient. Something indifferent. Something that did not care who you were or why you were there. By the time operations reached their final stages, the jungle no longer felt like terrain. It felt like a presence. And in the final part of this story, we'll confront what that presence left behind, not just in reports and abandoned missions, but in the minds of the men who survived it. Because some battles never really end. What followed these operations was not victory or defeat in any traditional sense. It was aftermath. When sniper teams finally withdrew from the deepest jungle zones, they carried no trophies, no clear metrics of success. What they brought back instead were altered instincts, reflexes shaped not by enemy contact, but by prolonged exposure to something far older and less predictable than human warfare. The war, for them, did not end at extraction. Military psychologists reviewing post-mission behavior noticed something unusual. These men did not respond to conventional combat triggers in the same way as others. Loud noises were not the problem. Crowds were not the problem. Silence was. A quiet room. A still forest. An unmoving night. Veterans spoke about an enduring sensation of being watched, not by people, but by the environment itself. The feeling followed them home. Into rural areas. Into parks. Sometimes even into their own bedrooms, where the absence of sound felt oppressive rather than calming. This was not superstition. It was conditioning. In Southeast Asia, silence meant danger. Stillness meant proximity. The jungle had trained them to associate calm with threat. And unlike enemy tactics, this conditioning could not be unlearned through logic. Some veterans reported sleeping with lights on for years. Others avoided wooded areas entirely, despite once being comfortable operating alone for days in far worse conditions. A few returned to hunting or wilderness travel, not out of comfort, but as a way to reclaim control. Some succeeded. Many did not. The official records rarely mention animals by name. They don't need to. The impact is visible in the language: aborted due to environmental interference, position compromised without enemy contact, psychological fatigue exceeding acceptable thresholds. These are polite phrases. Behind them were moments when the human nervous system reached its limits. What makes this chapter of the war so unsettling is not the danger itself, but the implication it carries. These encounters exposed a truth that modern warfare prefers to ignore: technology, training, and doctrine do not grant dominance over nature. They only create the illusion of it. In the jungles of Southeast Asia, American snipers learned that mastery of concealment meant nothing to predators evolved over millions of years to detect intrusion. That patience could be matched. That silence could be weaponized against you. And perhaps most unsettling of all, that fear does not always come from intent. Sometimes it comes from indifference. The jungle did not hate them. It did not pursue objectives. It simply existed. And in that existence, it reshaped missions, altered tactics, and left psychological scars deeper than many firefights ever did. This is a side of war rarely discussed. Not because it is unimportant, but because it reminds us how fragile human control truly is when stripped of civilization's buffers. To the veterans who endured these silent confrontations, this story is not about animals or terrain. It is about survival at the edge of human dominance. If this story changed how you think about war, consider supporting this channel. Like the video, subscribe, and share it with those who believe every battlefield is defined only by human enemies. Some wars are fought against the environment itself. And some of those wars never really end.